Hello everyone. In this session, I am going to talk about guidances on managing outsourcing risk. So, one of the major risks today, especially from an operations perspective. So, in this session, the key areas that we are looking at is first of all, what is outsourcing risk? I think most of us know it, especially when a work is being outsourced to a third party, based on the kind of reputation, based on uh, the various factors associated with the third party, the risk can come up for the bank. Now, that is where we are calling an outsourcing risk. So, the kind of risks that are coming up because of the use of various service providers for various operations related activities. Then what kind of risk management programs can be implemented to overcome this outsourcing risk? And if at all I'm looking at evaluating the third party service providers, what are the various due diligence related activities that are conducted? So, talking about the outsourcing risk, the risk that is primarily coming because of the usage of service providers for various activities. So some kind of risk can be based on the activity itself, what activity we are outsourcing, whether it is worth giving that activity to the third party or whether it is good enough doing that activity internally itself. So one could be primarily based on the activity. Some activities are worth handling internal to the organization itself and are not worth outsourcing, whereas some kind of activities can be outsourced. So even within those activities which can be outsourced, sometimes the risk can come because of the party who is taking that outsourcing activity. But whatever it is, whether the risk is because of the activity or because of the provider, whatever it is, it needs to be managed effectively. Otherwise, the financial institution or the bank which has actually outsourced that activity can start facing various regulatory actions, and financially also there could be a huge amount of loss and probably reputation could be lost, and it can go towards the litigation process as well. Now if you broadly look at the various kinds of risks that can come up, one, compliance, right? Let's say we are talking about a service provider. Whatever the services they are offering, whatever the products they are offering, they are not complying with the laws and the regulations of the country. So, using those parties as service providers is a big compliance risk. Then there is a concentration risk as well. Think of a service provider for a particular activity. Let's say for a particular activity we have only a very few service providers, right, where their bargaining power is much higher, and they are concentrated in a very small geographic region. They are not spread out. So you have to go to that particular service provider only. Let's say two or three are there concentrated in one small geography. So even if you are in the other end of the country, you may have to go to them to get your works outsourced to them. So that kind of a risk is what is called as a concentration risk. So the monitoring of the service provider becomes very difficult because of this concentration risk. Then we are talking about the reputation risk. So even if let's say a service provider does not perform well, right, your tasks, whatever you have outsourced, the quality of compliance or probably the quality of execution of that particular task is very poor, and that is sufficient. I mean, you will lose your own reputation because the service provider did not provide a good job. And if it involves end customers, probably your reputation is lost within no time. So you have to really focus on the reputational risks as well. Country risks come up especially when you are outsourcing to a party who is in another country altogether. So based on the economic situation of that country, social situation, political condition, where the service provider is located, this particular financial institution might be exposed to an additional risk as well. And if the processes of the service provider are faulty, or any kinds of external events associated with the service provider, or some kind of fraud from the employees of the service provider, because of all these things, you can be additionally exposed to operational risks. And similarly, the legal risks are also possible when there are lawsuits coming up against the service provider. So when you are outsourcing your activity to a service provider, you should be aware of all these kinds of risks that can crop up, and there should be a proper risk mitigation plan also to get away with all these risks. Now this is where I am talking about the various risk management or risk mitigation programs. First of all, objective wise, they should be risk focused. Clear cut in oversight of the service provider needs to be done. Clear cut oversight of the various activities need to be in place. So based on the lines of the levels of risk that are taken up, the controls that are being put in place, the oversight should be in line with the level of risk taken. And all those activities that you have outsourced, first do a categorization. What is the level of impact, financial impact? So you can see whether the financial impact is low or high. Look out for those kind of activities which can have a significant impact on the financial condition of the financial institution. So the more and more critical they are, the more should be the risk management plan very tightly built up in place. So if there is anything that is involving sensitive customer information, you should be very clearly targeting your risk management program. Any kind of activities that are critical to the overall operations of the business, which can challenge the existence of the operations of the business, any new bank products that are coming up, new services coming up, for all these things there should be tighter controls in place. All these kind of activities mentioned above, they can be a threat to the viability and reputation of the bank per se. And even if the service provider is not complying with the various processes, even that could be a big challenge. So from a compliance perspective also, the same management controls that are put in place need to be addressed. So whatever the risk management program against a particular service provider that you are putting in place, how much formal it should be, what should be the depth of that particular program. It is purely based on how much critical activity you have outsourced, what is the level of criticality of the activity that you have outsourced, what is the complexity of the activity that you have outsourced, and how many business activities you have outsourced, right? Even the frequency matters a lot. So when we talk about assessing, so I suggest that you look at the 6 main dimensions, 6 main stages as a part of the risk management program. First, do a risk assessment. Should I first of all outsource or not? Is it worth taking up this activity internally, or should we outsource it to some third party service provider? What would be the typical cost involved? What would be the kind of benefit we get when we are outsourcing it to the other party? So this assessment has to be updated at periodic intervals, and wherever required, you revise the mitigation plan accordingly. So the assessment should be done at every stage before you get into the outsourcing process. But the most important phase is the due diligence. How do I really choose the various service providers? I should do a very thorough background verification check of the service provider. evaluate the reputation of the service provider, what is the strategy of the provider, look at the financial numbers. I'll have a detailed slide. The next slide will be detailed out based on the due diligence aspects of the service providers itself. But again, if I have to look at the different dimensions, do a thorough background verification check, do a reputation analysis, evaluate the financial performance of the service provider, look at the various operational controls and internal controls that the service provider is having, and various contractual provisions that needs to get in once you have finalized your service provider, once you have shortlisted your service provider. The contractual provision should be very clearly detailed out, highlighting the scope of work, what is in the scope, what is out of scope, what activities will be outsourced. So the entire scope of work should be clearly documented. The cost considerations for the entire activity needs to be discussed in detail and penned out. The compensation structures need to be clearly highlighted as a part of the contractual document. What is the periodicity of the audit that is performed needs to be highlighted. The SLAs need to be set in place. The service level agreement should be very much clearly in place, highlighting the performance standards, what are the minimum expectations from the service provider. With respect to the data, the confidentiality, the processes, leaking of the data to the outsiders, sharing of the data with various third parties. So there should be clear-cut processes in place with respect to confidentiality. We talk about non-confidential agreements, the confidentiality agreements kind of stuff, or non-disclosure agreement, NDAs kind of stuff, typically signed by various parties to ensure that the third party is taking up this job without any kind of violating the confidentiality agreements. Then regarding the ownership structure of the third party service provider, licensing details, the indemnification aspects with respect to what extent the services are being provided, and if at all any loss occurs, who would be responsible for what kind of a loss. So taking ownership or the responsibility for the kind of loss that is incurred. Then the default activities, right? What if the service provider defaults on the provision of the services? So the rules relating to the termination of the service with the service provider needs to be documented. What if any kinds of disputes are coming up? What is the dispute resolution process? Who would be involved as a part of the committee to resolve the disputes? So all these activities should be clearly documented once you have highlighted, once you have identified your service provider and you have made a plan in terms of going ahead with that particular service provider for the different kinds of services. Similarly, insurance aspects, then consumer complaints, what is the kind of SLAs associated with handling the customer complaints, the contingency plans from the subcontractor, from the service provider. If he is doing any kind of subcontracting to someone else, again, what are the rules associated with the subcontracting? Does he have a policy in place to take care of the subcontracting activities? So all these things need to be evaluated in depth. Then coming up to the incentive compensation review. So at what point the incentive will be updated, compensation plans. So at what time points the payments would be done, what are the minimum delivery checks that are to be done, and what is the frequency of payment. All these things would be taken care as a part of the compensation review. Then at regular intervals you are trying to monitor the service provider. What is his financial condition? Is it going awkwardly bad, or is it more or less manageable? What are the on a regular basis you are looking at the internal controls that the service provider is having in place, and if at all there are some kind of discrepancies that are being observed, we need to have an escalation process also in place. And finally, we are looking at the contingency plans. We are thoroughly evaluating the business continuity of the service provider before getting into an agreement with the same. Then we are also looking at one of the most important out of those 6 core elements that I have highlighted, the due diligence. What are the various things I am doing as a part of the due diligence? Broadly, you put them into 3 categories. One, the business background, reputation, and the strategy check. Right? What is the status of the service provider in the industry? Look at their corporate history, the qualifications of the various senior members and the management team of the service provider. Do a thorough background verification check. Assess the reputation of the service provider. What is the business model of the service provider? What is the mission statement? Right? Look at the various quality initiatives taken up by the service provider, service philosophy of the provider, the organizational philosophies, they all need to be thoroughly verified. That's one of the due diligence process. And even references, whatever are being provided by the service provider, have a thorough check on them, so that the past record, how did the service provider really perform in the past, can very well be verified to the core. Then the second dimension to be looked at is the financials. Look at the most recent financial statements, annual report. So you can come to an assessment with respect to the commitment which can be shown by the service provider, the capital strength of the provider, the liquidity requirements, as well as the operating activities and the results associated with the operating activities. What is the level of sustainability of the service provider? How long has he been providing that kind of a service? Right? What is his market share for this particular service? Who are the competitors to this particular service provider, and how is his market share typically growing over the period? And the business relationship on the service provider's financial condition. Look at the potential impact of what could be your business relationship impact because of the financial condition of the service provider. What is the level of commitment that the service provider has given to the contracted services? Will he be in a position to perform all the services for the entire duration of the contract, or do you sense something fishy there? And you could also look at, does the service provider have the adequate insurance coverage? And if at all the service provider is engaging any of the subcontractors for that particular activity, what is the financial condition of the subcontractors? And would it be possible that because of the performance of the subcontractors, the financial condition of your service provider will be affected, which would again have an impact on the financial condition of the institution itself. So let there be a kind of a thorough check on the financial performance and the condition related aspects. And also you can look at the operations and internal controls. What are the internal controls, auditing processes internally that are being taken up by the service provider? So facilities management process, does he require, is he working from a own premises, or is he sharing the facilities? So what are the access requirements for people getting in and getting out of that premises? What are the various training activities that are going on? And what is the level of compliance with respect to the trainings? Are all employees getting trained on various practices and procedures? What is the level of security of various systems? Can I ensure the data security within the organization? What is the kind of data management and data security procedure that the firm is typically following? How is the privacy of the various data that is within the organization typically protected? Confidentiality, what is their track record with respect to maintaining the confidentiality of the information? Maintenance and retention of the various records. Do they have a contingency planning in place? To what extent the various practices, policies, systems are developed and maintained? What are the various policies and procedures with respect to service support and delivery? Are they performing thorough employee background verification checks? And are they adhering to various applicable laws, regulations, etc.? So all these things need to be done in full before any bank or any financial institution is trying to outsource its activities to third parties. So these are some of the major activities, major aspects with respect to the outsourcing risk. Any further queries you have, you can very well get in touch with me by giving me a call on the number that I have given below, or you can send in an email. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.